The night sky over Europe once hid a secret so strange, so daring, that even decades later it feels unreal. Imagine a war where technology evolves faster than soldiers can march, where unseen waves in the air decide whether cities will burn or survive. In that kind of world, deception becomes more powerful than firepower, and a single clever idea can change the course of history. This is the story of one such idea. A trick so audacious that Germany's entire air defense network was thrown into confusion, chasing ghosts in the sky that never existed. It begins long before the trick itself, in an age when radar was still a young, mysterious invention. Radar wasn't a household word yet. It was a tool whispered about in laboratories, a strange ability to see far beyond human eyes using invisible pulses of energy. But to the nations preparing for war in the late 1930s, radar meant something far more important: survival. Whoever mastered it first would own the skies. Germany, believing its technology was unmatched, poured enormous resources into constructing an air defense system so advanced and so dense that foreign bombers would supposedly have no chance of crossing its borders unnoticed. Lines of massive radar towers, connected by communication bunkers and quick-response fighter units, created what the German High Command called an impenetrable web, a fortress of radio waves stretching from the North Sea to deep inside Europe, a network designed to detect anything that dared to move in the night. But there was a flaw, a tiny, clever, unexpected flaw that no one in Germany imagined an enemy could exploit. A weakness not in steel, or in codebooks, or in machinery, but in human belief. The belief that their radar was perfect. Across the channel, British scientists had been watching. They knew Germany relied on radar for everything: early warnings, night interceptions, coordination of anti-aircraft guns. If that system ever collapsed, even briefly, chaos would ripple across the sky. But the British Royal Air Force couldn't simply destroy the towers. They were too many, too spread out, and too heavily defended. So instead, a strange idea began to form. The kind of idea that seems impossible until someone is desperate enough to try it. What if, instead of hiding from German radar, they could trick it? What if they could make the radar see things that weren't real? But the strangest part was still to come. Soon after the first phase of the operation, German intelligence teams were scrambled to find the cause of the radar anomalies. They combed fields where the phantom formations had passed, searching for evidence of aircraft, wreckage, or parachuted equipment. Instead, they found nothing but thin metallic strips lying in fields, hanging from trees, stuck in rooftops. To the investigators, the material seemed trivial, scraps of garbage carried by the wind. They didn't understand what they were looking at. They didn't realize these strips were the very reason their entire defense network had fallen apart. Meanwhile, Allied scientific teams continued refining the technique. They experimented with different lengths of foil, discovering how to match specific radar bands used by Germany. They tested high-altitude drops, low-altitude drops, even timed releases to simulate moving formations. The illusion grew more convincing with every adjustment, evolving from crude clusters of echoes into organized streams that looked like perfectly aligned bomber waves. Germany was forced to adapt. In some regions, radar operators were ordered to ignore certain readings. But this created a dangerous problem. What if a real attack came at the same moment as a phantom one? How could they tell the difference? The answer was simple: they couldn't. And that uncertainty cost them dearly. Historians would later remark that this single innovation reshaped the air war more than many weapons ever did. By creating doubt, the British gained more freedom of movement in the skies. By forcing the Germans to divide their defenses between real and fake threats, they weakened the effectiveness of both. And by showing that the German radar network could be fooled so easily, they shattered the myth of German technological invincibility. Still, it wasn't enough. A trick is worthless unless the enemy believes it. The British needed Germany to fall for it completely, to trust their instruments more than their instincts. And so planning began for an operation unlike any other. A mission that didn't involve bombs, bullets, or engines roaring through the night. A mission based solely on deception, manipulation, and the psychology of war. But as the plan grew, so did the fear. What if Germany discovered the trick? What if the operation failed and alerted the enemy instead of confusing them? What if Germany adapted and rendered the strategy useless before it even started? This wasn't just a gamble. It was a leap into darkness with no guarantee of landing safely. By the time the operation was approved, Even the highest-ranking British commanders felt uneasy, because this wasn't simply about creating phantom targets. It was about entering the enemy's mind. It was about turning Germany's greatest strength, its radar network, into its greatest vulnerability. And so, late one night, with engines rumbling and tension tightening every breath, Allied planes took off carrying an unusual payload that no one outside a tight circle of secrecy could have imagined. They flew toward the edge of German territory, toward the invisible web of radar beams waiting to detect them. Only this time, what the radars picked up wouldn't be real. It would be the beginning of an illusion so convincing that Germany would scramble fighters, fire anti-aircraft guns, and mobilize entire sectors, all for shadows. The trick was ready, and no one in Germany had the slightest idea what was about to hit them. The moment the operation began, the night sky seemed calm, almost too calm for what was about to unfold. The Allied aircraft reached their designated points, flying low, slow, and silent through corridors of darkness. Beneath them, Europe slept under thick clouds, unaware that one of the strangest tricks of the war was about to play out thousands of feet above. Inside each British aircraft, crew members opened containers filled not with bombs, but with bundles of thin metallic strips, harmless to the touch, weightless in the air, simple enough to make from household materials. Yet these strips had been cut to a very specific length, a length calculated to match the frequency of German radar. When dropped in massive quantities, they would fall slowly, flipping and spinning like silver leaves. And with every twist, they would reflect radar waves perfectly, creating enormous blips that looked exactly like real aircraft formations. The idea was so simple, it felt absurd. Thin strips of aluminum, tricking a radar network engineered with German precision. But when the first bundles were released, fluttering into the night, something astonishing happened. On German radar screens, dozens of dots suddenly appeared, where only silence had existed moments earlier. They weren't small or faint. They were strong, bold signatures, moving like a bomber squadron heading straight into German airspace. Operators stared at the screens, confused. They double-checked equipment. They adjusted dials. Nothing changed. The blips remained. Then more strips were dropped. Then more, and the screens exploded into chaos. What had started as a single phantom formation now looked like multiple waves of incoming bombers. Hundreds of them. Germany's air defense network had no choice but to react. Sirens wailed through underground bunkers. Officers scrambled for intercept orders. Fighter pilots raced to their planes, engines roaring to life in the darkness. Anti-aircraft guns rotated toward the sky, their crews preparing for a massive assault they believed was moments away. The trick had worked, but this was only the beginning. What made the operation even more powerful was timing. At that same moment, real Allied bombers were approaching different sectors, hoping to slip through while German fighters chased illusions. Radar operators couldn't understand what they were seeing. Some believed their equipment had malfunctioned. Others insisted the signals were genuine. Senior commanders argued over the radio, desperate to determine whether this was an attack or something else entirely. Meanwhile, thousands of shimmering metallic strips drifted gracefully toward the Earth, still reflecting radar waves as they fell. Remember, life will test you, but it will never break you if you hold on to what you know to be true. Every few seconds, new blips appeared. Some merged together, some split apart. It didn't matter. To the German operators, everything looked like a fleet of bombers, and every moment they spent trying to make sense of it wasted precious time. Here is where the operation became almost surreal. Pilots flying through the night reported seeing German searchlights sweeping empty skies, firing at shadows. Entire fighter wings were redirected to intercept formations that did not exist. Anti-aircraft crews opened fire into nothingness, convinced enemy aircraft were cloaked in the clouds above. In command bunkers, frustration turned into panic. The radar screens were lying, but no one knew why or how. Some officers began to question whether the British had invented a new type of fast-moving bomber. Others believed the Allies were using advanced jamming devices. A few even claimed the radar systems themselves were somehow being attacked. No one suspected the truth, that the mystery came from nothing more than millions of tiny strips of metal slowly drifting through the night. The brilliance of the trick didn't lie in the technology, it lay in understanding the psychology of war. Germany trusted radar so deeply that the idea of questioning it felt impossible. If the screen showed a bomber squadron approaching, it had to be real. That conviction gave the Allies all the room they needed to create a deception so powerful it echoed through every branch of the German defense network. But the strangest part was still to come. Soon after the first phase of the operation, German intelligence teams were scrambled to find the cause of the radar anomalies. They combed fields where the phantom formations had passed, searching for evidence of aircraft, wreckage, or parachuted equipment. Instead, they found nothing but thin metallic strips lying in fields, hanging from trees, stuck in rooftops. To the investigators, the material seemed trivial, scraps of garbage carried by the wind. They didn't understand what they were looking at. They didn't realize these strips were the very reason their entire defense network had fallen apart. Meanwhile, Allied scientific teams continued refining the technique. They experimented with different lengths of foil, discovering how to match specific radar bands used by Germany. They tested high-altitude drops, low-altitude drops, even timed releases to simulate moving formations. The illusion grew more convincing with every adjustment, evolving from crude clusters of echoes into organized streams that looked like perfectly aligned bomber waves. Germany was forced to adapt. In some regions, radar operators were ordered to ignore certain readings. But this created a dangerous problem. What if a real attack came at the same moment as a phantom one? How could they tell the difference? The answer was simple. They couldn't. And that uncertainty cost them dearly. Historians would later remark that this single innovation reshaped the air war more than many weapons ever did. By creating doubt, the British gained more freedom of movement in the skies. By forcing the Germans to divide their defenses between real and fake threats, they weakened the effectiveness of both. And by showing that the German radar network could be fooled so easily, they shattered the myth of German technological invincibility. But it wasn't just a clever trick. It was a turning point. A moment when the balance of power subtly, quietly shifted. And as more operations used the same method, larger drops, more coordinated illusions, deeper penetrations into German territory, the deception grew into something legendary. Each mission pushed German defenses further into confusion, forcing them to rely less on radar and more on guesswork. That guesswork opened the door for some of the most daring Allied missions of the war. Yet even with all this success, a question lingered among the scientists and strategists behind the trick. How long could the deception last? Would Germany eventually figure it out? Would they discover a countermeasure? Would the illusion collapse just as quickly as it had been created? The answer would arrive soon, in the most dramatic way possible, during a night when the stakes were higher than ever, when one of the largest and most dangerous bombing operations of the war depended entirely on this strange, almost laughably simple invention. And on that night, the world would witness the full power of the radar trick that fooled an entire nation. The night chosen for the final test of the radar trick felt heavier than most. Even seasoned pilots sensed something unusual in the air, a silence too thick, a darkness too deep, a tension that stretched from the hangars to the horizon. This was not just another mission. This was the kind of night that history would remember, one that demanded everything the Allies had learned, created, refined, and hoped for. Dozens of bombers lined up across airfields, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Their target lay deep inside Germany, protected by layers of defenses so dense that the operation had been considered nearly impossible only months earlier. But tonight, the bombers would not fly alone. They would be escorted by legions of ghosts, phantom squadrons made not of steel and pilots, but of drifting metallic strips that glimmered invisibly in the radar beams sweeping across the sky. As the real bomber force lifted into the air, other aircraft took off on parallel routes, their mission not to drop bombs but to release the deception that would shield the entire operation. Containers were opened, bundles were pushed out into the roaring wind, and once again, countless strips fluttered downward like sparkling snowflakes no one could see. They spread out across miles of darkness, catching the radar pulses and reflecting them back with perfect clarity. German radar rooms lit up instantly, screens filled with dense patterns of blips, more blips than any operator had ever seen at one time. Entire wings of phantom bombers appeared to be approaching from multiple directions, Some vectors suggested a massive northern assault. Others indicated a dangerous southern diversion. And in the center, the strongest signature of all hinted at a colossal attack heading straight for the heart of Germany. Commanders stared in disbelief. This wasn't just an attack. It looked like an invasion from the sky. Orders flew across radio channels. Airfields scrambled their fighters in every direction. Anti-aircraft guns roared awake. Searchlights sliced open the night sky, wildly sweeping for targets they were certain were overhead. And the deeper the confusion spread, the more impossible it became to sort real threats from illusions. Meanwhile, the real bomber force slipped quietly across the border, gliding through corridors of darkness Germany no longer controlled. Their path, once considered suicidal, now lay shockingly open. Radar crews were too busy chasing ghosts to notice the silent formation passing through the gaps. One group of German interceptors flew high, burning precious fuel in pursuit of blips that drifted slowly, inexplicably, toward the ground. Another squadron circled endlessly, reporting targets that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Some pilots swore they saw shadows moving below, shapes darting between the clouds, illusions formed by stress, adrenaline, and a sky filled with echoes of nothing. In one bunker, a senior commander pounded a table in frustration, convinced that multiple bomber streams were about to converge on industrial cities across the region. He redirected entire divisions of anti-aircraft guns. He ordered emergency evacuations. Every decision he made, every shift in strategy, every movement of troops, was influenced by the shimmering strips drifting silently toward the earth. Back in the real bomber formation, crews listened to the chatter of confused German interceptors over open frequencies. Some pilots exchanged glances in disbelief. They had flown through fierce defenses before, storms of flak, swarms of fighters. But tonight, the sky felt strangely empty. It was as if the war had been put on pause for them, as if the enemy had momentarily stepped away from the battlefield without knowing it. The target came into view. Bomb bays opened. Engines roared in the cold night air as the mission that once seemed impossible unfolded with chilling precision. Explosions lit the horizon in bright flashes, the only moments of color in an otherwise endless ocean of darkness. The bombers turned home, expecting retaliation, expecting chaos, but instead found only silence. The return flight felt unreal. German intercept. Only when the metallic strips finally settled on fields, forests, and rooftops did the illusion begin to fade. Searchlights dimmed. Gun crews stood down. Pilots landed, frustrated and confused. Radar operators stared at screens that slowly cleared, returning to empty stillness. Investigators were sent out again, rushing into the night to find evidence of the attack Germany thought it had faced. What they discovered were the same thin, harmless strips of foil, glittering faintly in moonlight. That was the moment some began to understand, too late, that they had been fighting shadows. When the reports finally reached high command, silence filled the room. No one wanted to believe that their entire radar system, their most trusted line of defense, had been fooled by something so primitive. But the evidence was undeniable. Germany had mobilized massive resources to fight an enemy that existed only on their screens. The shock was more than technological, it was psychological. A nation that prided itself on precision engineering had been outwitted by a trick that cost almost nothing to implement. The more the truth spread among officers, the more devastating the realization became. If the enemy could manipulate their radar once, they could do it again, and again, and again. From that night onward, Germany's confidence in its radar network never fully recovered. Every blip became suspicious. Every signal demanded verification. Decisions slowed. Mistakes multiplied. And in a war where time was everything, hesitation became as deadly as any bomb. For the Allies, the success of the operation marked a turning point. What began as a desperate gamble had grown into one of the most effective deceptions of the entire conflict. The trick was used repeatedly across campaigns, shielding bombers, confusing defenses, and reshaping strategies on both sides of the war. It turned the tide in skies that once belonged firmly to Germany, and it proved something deeper than technological superiority. it proved the power of imagination. The story of this radar trick is not just a tale of military cunning. It is a reminder that in moments of crisis, brilliance often comes from unexpected ideas. Ideas that seem too simple, too strange, too ridiculous to work until they do. Sometimes the smallest things can change the direction of history. Sometimes the greatest weapons are not forged from steel, but conceived in minds willing to see the world differently. And so this chapter closes, not with the roar of engines or the flash of explosions, but with a quiet drift of metallic strips falling gently through the night, each one a silent witness to the moment when an entire nation was blinded by a handful of glimmering illusions. A moment when deception reshaped the sky,